Hello, hello. Hey, this works. Look at that. Welcome, everybody, to Comics in the City 2018. Woo. My name is Matt Sility. I have the great pleasure of chairing the MFA in Comics program here at the California College of the Arts. And you don't have to do that. It's been a long week. First thing I want to do is I want to welcome anybody who is their first time here at CCA. So please raise your hand if it's your first time at CCA. Thank you for coming. Give a nice round of applause. Woo! All right, so for those of you sitting anywhere behind row 3, hey, what are you doing in row 5? The first 3 rows are filled with cartoonists who have come to CCA to earn their MFA in comics. We have students who are here for their final summer who are going to graduate at the end of July. Stand up. Yeah. All right. All right. All right, they get a whole night to themselves so they can sit down. Then we have students that I'm so happy came back for a second summer. And before they stand up, next Friday, we're going to have Julia Wirtz on stage. And then afterwards, we're all going to go over to the Hubble Street Gallery, which is just in walking distance, and we're going to see their first comics gallery show. So stand up. That's them. Woo! All right. And then, last but not least, we have students who have been in our program for the sum total of 1 week. And they survived classes 9 in the morning to 7 at night, Monday through Friday. They did a fabulous job. Go ahead and stand up and let's give them a nice round of applause. All right. So every Friday for the rest of the month, we have fabulous speakers coming in. And afterwards, we always like to celebrate. Tonight, we're going to have books for sale by our fabulous guest. It's all at 195 DeHaro. And what happens is all the students saunter that way and just follow them because they're hungry, and there will be food and drink over there. But other than that, I just want to get things underway by introducing the person who will introduce our guest. Our wonderful professor of our History and Cultural Context seminar, one of our mentors that all of our students work with, and a fabulous cartoonist in his own right. Please give a nice round of applause for Justin Hall.
Hello. I am so incredibly thrilled about doing this event right here with this the speaker. Though I look super calm and cool and collected on the outside, I'm like geeking out hardcore on the inside because J.H. Williams III is one of my favorite artists. I think he's one of the greatest artists working in America right now in the comics world, and he's best known for work on titles Chase, Promethea, Desolation Jones, Batwoman, Sandman Overture. He's collaborated with some of the best writers in the field, such as Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Grant Morrison, Warren Ellis, and Greg Rucka. He's also handled the writing chores himself on several of his books. And he's currently working on a new series called Echolands. We'll see some of that art tonight, which is very exciting. He's working on that with Haden Blackman. And we'll be seeing some and we'll also be talking about an amazing anthology book that he and his wife, Wendy Wright Williams, who's here as well, and she'll come up on stage as well, and we'll talk about this benefit book that they put together called Where We Live, which is about the horrible shooting in Las Vegas, which is where they do live in Las Vegas. And they put together this anthology book as a benefit. So we'll talk about that as well. So that's how it's going to go. I'm going to have a conversation with JH. And then we'll bring Wendy on stage, and we'll have a conversation about the benefit book. And then we'll open it up to some questions, Q&A, and then we'll saunter over to the Grad Writing Center for some refreshments and signings and such. So I am absolutely thrilled from the bottom of my geeky heart to welcome J.H. Williams to the stage. Please give it up. Yeah. All right. All right. Let's. First, I've got some slides that I'll be, yeah, actually, can I grab a volunteer from the audience to hit the slide show one? Yeah. Yeah, all right, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. But I figured first. So actually, we are actually starting with a slideshow that I prepared for this. The first thing I wanted to ask you was, this is an image that's on your website. What the hell's going on? What is that? What's going on?
Can I remember? Well, when I first got my website going, I wanted to do this weird experiment to see if I could actually blog a creative thing every day. And whether it was crappy or not, it was just like, I have to do it to see if I could do something every day. And that was sort of like the graphic I made to represent that page on my website.
So how did you come into that image?
I'm trying to remember what the numbers are for.
I do remember there's a thing that Grant Morrison talked about, kind of creating a sigil, like a magical sigil from an idea.
Yes. The number is, I can't remember why I chose. Maybe that's the number of days or something. I can't remember. It's like 5 years ago at least. But the symbol itself, that's based on this thing called the Alphabet of Desire, which is Osmond Spare.
Okay.
Came up with this, and what it is, it's like this weird metaphysical thing that you can do that's kind of ritualistic, where you come up with a phrase or a mantra or a goal that you're wanting to aspire to, and you take the letters of the phrase and you concoct this sigil out of it. But you don't tell anyone what it is.
Okay. Sorry for the question then.
Right. And it's funny that I've forgotten what it is, because ultimately that's what you sort of do, this thing, and you ruminate on it, and then you let it go and sort of forget what it is. And it's supposed to sort of like bring whatever that you're aspiring to, kind of bring that to you metaphysically, which I thought was kind of interesting. I learned about that from Alan Moore working on Promethea, and I actually ended up applying that to when I did the Sword album art cover for them, which was interesting.
So that is so you've done a couple different concept art and album covers for bands, notably the Sword and Blondie.
Yeah.
Yeah. So explain just. I mean, we're going to talk about comics for the most part, but I'm excited to hear about how that happened or what your thought process was behind that.
Well, I was always, me and my wife Wendy are huge music fans, and I always wanted to do art for music, and always was looking for different ways to try to do it. And surprisingly, I had a lot of difficulty being able to achieve that for some reason. And then I was a fan of The Sword, and I've always been a fan of Blondie ever since I was a kid. The first record I ever bought with my own money was a Blondie record. Weirdly, we met Blondie at one of their concerts. We got these VIP passes, and I happened to, like, oh my God, I'm going to meet them, meet and greet. And I brought a copy of Batwoman with me to give to them. And the meet and greet was before the concert. And I was nervous as heck. I could barely speak to them. And then we went and saw the show. But then we got to be able to go backstage afterward. And while the opening band had been playing, they flipped through the book. And when they came out from getting relaxed after the show, they went straight for us. It was, me and my wife, James Syme, Kirsten, Victor, back there somewhere, was there, and started talking to us about the artwork in the book. And I don't know, the way I am, I just throw myself out there, even sometimes in an awkward situation, and I'm like, well, if you ever need an artist, just like, that's what I do. I have no expectations, but I'm just like, hey. And Chris Stein is who I was talking to, one of the founders of the band, and he was just quiet for a second. He goes, "Next album cover."
Right there.
Right then and there.
Holy
Just like that. And I'm
shit.
like, uh-huh. You know?
That works?
Weirdly, yeah. And James Syme, because he's a comics shop owner, he owns Isotope Comics here in San Francisco.
And it's also a Blondie freak.
Huge Blondie fan. He's went into like, I'm going to be his PR manager mode. And he's like, "Chris, do you realize who this guy is? This guy's worked with Alan Moore." And then Chris Stein goes, "You know Alan Moore?" Right? And I'm like, "Yeah." And it just started this whole weird conversation. And then, the night ended and we all went and had breakfast somewhere late at night. We're like, "Oh my God, we met Blondie and look what they said." And we got home the next morning and, at the time you're like, "Oh, you're meeting rock stars, right?" And you're like, "Oh, they're being nice. This is weird stuff like this gets said all the time. Nothing ever happens." By the time we got home, Chris Stein had already called my phone, left this long message on there saying, "I am so sorry. I didn't realize who you were. I looked you up and like, oh my God, you do know Alan Moore," and
Wow.
all this stuff. And next thing I know, it's like that was happening. But that was like, they had just released an album. That's what they were on tour for. So when he was saying the next album, I had no idea what that actually meant. And for them, talking to them, it's interesting because in their creative process, they're like, "Oh yeah, the next album will come out next year." And nope, it takes a lot longer than they even realize. They're just doing their thing. So after that, then I'm like, "This is awesome." So I had this in my head. So that gig came to me first. The Sword gig came to me second, but came out first. So the whole creative process was interesting. The way the Sword gig happened, I just randomly got an email from their business manager saying, "Hey, these guys are huge fans of yours. Do you want to do the album cover, for this upcoming album?" I'm like, "Heck yeah," So that was super exciting. And what was interesting to me creatively is two very different types of things, two different different types of music. And each job had its own creative challenges. What was fun for the Sword one was getting to work with the lead singer very closely on the ideas, presenting him the different ideas. And I talked to him about this because he was, when he was talking about the music, he was trying to tell me a little bit about, I don't know, the energy of what he was trying to convey in the lyrics and the music and the sense of mystery to it. And somehow it's like, "Oh, well, have you heard about this thing, called the Alphabet of Desire?" And he's like, "No, what is that?" And I explained it to him. He's like, "That's awesome." And I'm like, "Well, let's use that somehow." And then with the Blondie gig, what was fun about that and shocking to me and added a ton of pressure, but was interesting is, talking to them saying, "Hey, what do you want to do?" Because at this point I already been working with the Sword and kind of had this idea of like what that go back and forth is like between me and a rock star. And Chris Stein is like, I end up getting them on the phone, him and Debbie Harry on the phone, and that was just wild because she's trying to keep her dog calm, and so she's very all over the place, and I just wanted to talk to him like, what ideas do they have for the album, and I don't know why we had a conference call because they just ended up going, "Whatever you want to do." And I'm like, "This is Blondie, an iconic rock and roll band, world-renowned rock and roll band," and they're just saying, "Yeah, whatever you want to do." And then I'm like, "Okay,"
It's a stunningly beautiful piece.
Oh, thanks.
But I will say that if this means if Chris Stein is taking you away ever takes you away from comics, I will kick his ass. I'm kidding. So getting to comics, all right. Yeah. One of the, you're, I think of you as an incredible illustrator, but you're also really very much a designer. You really kind of plan out your pages in really interesting ways, I think. This is a double-page spread from Desolation Jones, and I wanted to kind of ask you how. And it's a climactic moment. There's a lot of words oftentimes in Warren Ellis' script, but this is pretty much a silent double-page spread. And it's a moment that has a lot of emotional impact, but it's also very violent. So I'm wondering how, in general, how you approach violence and kind of the visual depiction of violence, and then how this particular, how you create a kind of emotional impact through this page.
Okay, well, I mean, in terms of violence itself, I mean, a lot of Warren Ellis books tend to have violence in them. And even what's interesting to me about his writing in terms of violence, it doesn't ever feel like it's violence for gratuitous sake. It's emotionally driven, story-based content. But I wanted to find ways to kind of, how do I isolate the violence in a way that makes you feel something beyond what you would expect to feel. And when the book first started coming out, most of the time I try to avoid reading critiques. You don't want to do that most of the time. It's just never good. But one of the things that ended up being thrown at me when the book started coming out, people were like, "Oh, the violence is like it's presented almost in a I don't know, I can't remember the exact words, but they're like, it's so disturbing, you know." And I'm like, that's the point. If you're not disturbed by the violence, then it's not doing its goal. You should never be elated by it. You should be bothered by it. And so everything I did in the book was trying to see how I could evoke that through the symbolic use of it or the isolation of it, you know. And like with this, and I was also looking for ways to kind of use slowing the moments down to emphasize the emotional impact. So like, you know, the gunshot through the window, it's in full color, then it goes in black and white except for the blood. And that shock, it feels like it's a slap in the face, right? And then the next panel, I'm isolating the bullet that just went through her head, keeping it in black and white except for the blood. And you're like, and at this point in the story, you're engaged with the characters, and you're like, oh my God, what just happened to her? And all of it stems from, what happens to her, all of it stems from his actions and her allowing herself to get mixed up in his world and in his life. And Desolation Jones is sort of like this character that only bad stuff ever follows him around. And so I also thought that was interesting in showing that he's only going to bring death. Death follows him. He almost becomes death. He's a harbinger. And so when that happens, here's his friend. He's seeing her dead on the steering wheel. And then I used him focusing on her staring dead eyes at him, and he realizes he is death.
So this kind of visual depiction of that with the skull, I don't know if you guys can see it, but the skull kind of embedded in the eyeball there of her dead face, and then the blood dripping down and creating part of his face into a skull. Was that in the script, or was that you kind of coming up with that as a visual motif?
That was me. Yeah, that wasn't in the script. That was me trying to pull out the emotional and psychological and symbolic aspects that are in the script, in between the lines of the script.
And you're working with, it's Jose Villarrubia, right?
Yeah.
And he's one of the great colorists of ever, right?
Yeah, he's really great.
So how did you kind of talk him through this collaboration? I mean, how did that work?
It was interesting because, you know, I always try to be super collaborative, and because I think in design sense, I have to think in color. And that sometimes can create an interesting push and pull between all the parties, because I'm after something, he's after something, and trying to find that balance is fascinating. But, you know, there's very particular things, like this is a good example where I'm like, this has to go black and white. Trying to create that relationship where he can trust in my ideas and I can trust in his ideas. And being able to see the same thing on the page is interesting. But when you see the final result, you can see how it works. Where you're like, oh well, let's actually remove the color here, and actually what it does, it strengthens that image by removing the color, but it strengthens the other images that remain in color in a different way.
Yeah, it pops them out.
Yeah.
This is a double-page spread from Detective Comics, and the run that you did with Greg Rucka. And then you took over the character later.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of curious about, because this is also just such a heavily designed page, and you do a lot of work with double-page spreads.
Almost all.
Yeah, I noticed at some point in it was one of the series that all the kind of advertisements got kind of pushed to the back in order to allow that. So, thank God. Yeah, that's good. So something like this, does this? I mean, you have this kind of yin yang, beautiful yin yang kind of imagery going, and using the capes as kind of panel motifs. How much of that was in the scripts, and how much of this is what you bring to it?
A lot of this was me, but with this, Batwoman, what was cool about it, it was a little similar to my relationship with Alan Moore, where we talked about a lot of the ideas and themes before it was fully realized in the script. And so when Greg would talk to me about the issue, saying, oh, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, it would make me think of some ideas ahead of time. And I'd be like, hey, well, maybe, what do you think of this idea for the scene? And he'd be like, oh, that's awesome. And he would write it and kind of let me, knowing kind of roughly what I was going to do. And sometimes I would not always follow what the initial idea was. And sometimes I'd be very literal about what we originally discussed. And this one, I'm kind of torn about this one. I think in some ways it's effective, creating the symbology of how, because the two characters, for people who don't know this story, they're twin sisters. One is they're both psychologically messed up in different ways. One is trying to pursue good, and one's trying to pursue evil. And so that's why the yin and yang thing becomes important, because this is a big moment between the two of them, a final showdown, and I wanted to find some way to kind of represent the flip side of the coin between the two, and that's why I chose the layout that I did. But I think where I feel like it might have failed is that because it's so circular, I almost feel like that these panels here should have flipped upside down. So you had to turn the page.
So
which would really have reinforced the mental state of change
and,
between the two.
And you do that in other spots. So actually, can we actually flip ahead a couple? Another one. Yes. So this is a double-page spread from Promethea that you did with Alan Moore, and this you actually do have to flip the page to read it.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating. And I noticed you also. I think there's a moment in Sandman Overture when you do that as well. Generally, I tell my students, do not do this. So sorry, but I mean, a couple questions about it. I mean, what does it do to the reading process? How much can you control of how the reader reacts to that set of instructions, essentially? Right. Because some of them are going to respond, some of them won't. And then also, as comics are moving into digital spaces, do you worry about this? It's a very kind of art of the book thing to do, right? Yes. So what happens? Yeah. So your reactions to all that.
Anecdotally, the interesting thing about working on this particular spread is when Alan wrote it. Anybody here familiar with Alan Moore's scripts? How dense and crazy they can be?
We scare people with them in the first, like the first day.
Well, this one in particular was probably the most daunting piece of script I've ever read. It was, how many pages was it? Like, because she read them all too. 5 pages, 1 paragraph, single-spaced description to give me that.
And is he still doing the full caps, single space?
Oh yeah.
That is insane person writing.
It was dense.
Okay, all right.
And but what he was attempting to do is to verbally describe a Mobius strip. So he's going through all the ins and outs of the Mobius strip on how he thinks it works. And we're sitting there reading it, and we're like, our brains are melting just trying to get through this. And so we actually made a Mobius strip. We physically kind of got this ribbon and made one.
Wow.
And I used that as my reference instead of the script.
That's amazing.
And when we turned in the pages, Alan was like, "This is super fascinating because you created a different Mobius strip than what I wrote, but they both work." And so I was like, "Okay, great." But in terms of like relying on the audience to follow along without using arrows saying, "Now you go here, now you go here," it's an experiment. You don't know if it's going to work until you do it, and either it does or it doesn't. And in terms of the digital realm that we live in now, even my most recent work on Salmon Overture, where we did something similar, where it flipped for a bit, we're kind of like, no, the digital world needs to catch up to us. We're trying to create an experience, and with Promethea and Sandman Overture, in the ways that they're similar is that they're trying to create a different mind space, a different visceral experience, emotionally, metaphysically. Try to create you to think differently. And sometimes, if you rely too much on just like, well, this is what the digital formats dictate, so you can't break that. You kind of have to say, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to break it. And people have to, if they want to experience it the way it needs to be experienced, they have to read it as a physical book.
So, I mean, and I totally understand how that sense of discombobulation would actually really fit thematically with what both of those pieces were doing. Yeah. Are you ever fascinated with using webcomics in particular to do that kind of thing as a digital native? Like, I mean, you think about Scott McCloud's Infinite Canvas. You think about, all these kinds of interactivities that you can build into digital comics. Have you thought about experimenting with that stuff?
Yeah, me and a friend of mine, the guy I was telling you about earlier, who works at the Merced University, John. One of the first conversations we had was about what could be done with digital comics that would go beyond what you could expect from them. And ultimately we decided to really take it as far as you can, it would end up having to be a lifetime's work. Because to take advantage of what you can do digitally with that, it's sort of creating endless rabbit holes, I think, because you can do the touch and click thing, and every time you touch and click, it leads you somewhere else. And we thought, wow, wouldn't it be interesting to create a comic that existed only online, and depending what you clicked on in the story, it would take you in a completely different direction, and whether you could get back to where you were, who knows? That's an endless narrative, right?
Creates a lot of challenges both in terms of illustration, but also in terms of writing, right? I mean,
yeah. And that creatively is like, wow, wouldn't that be so cool? I could never find the time to do that. It's like
one project at a time. Can we flip back? Let's go. Yeah. Let's go. So this is this is another double page spread from Detective Comics. I wanted to ask you.
I think this is the Batwoman.
Oh, this is Batwoman. Oh,
yeah,
this is already Batwoman. Yeah. So you're writing this at this point with Haden Blackman, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay. I want to ask about that, but first I just want to, one of the things that really fascinates me about the work that you're especially doing in Batwoman is that this shows up in a lot of your work, but you use different styles and tools and techniques to illustrate different characters in different locations in the same page. So in this set of inset panels, you're using a kind of graphic, inked lines, and then you're using a kind of a painterly effect for the big back image. But Batwoman is actually always painted, I think, even when she's in the other panels. How does that? What are you trying to achieve? I mean, it's very, very unusual for an illustrator to do this. So how did you come across this technique, and what does it do for you?
Well, I mean, everything kind of goes back to Alan Moore. When I worked on Promethea with Alan, that was such a opening experience. It was the first comic that I got to do where anything was fair game. And when Alan realized that anything was fair game because I was willing to jump off a cliff with him, we decided, like, how far could we push things? How far could we push things stylistically? And we, I came to the conclusion that because Promethea explored art. It was sort of a love letter to art in a lot of ways. And because of that, we purposefully created different sequences to evoke different emotional responses and explore different types of art, the way it could look,
There's different stages of the Kabbalah, I think, at one point, where you have different illustration styles relating to different...
Yeah, exactly. And we did that on every cover, too, where we would rapidly change every cover. You didn't know what you're going to get. And what that taught me at that stage in my creative thinking was the way something is drawn or styled or painted or whatever the medium is has this subliminal effect on whoever's looking at it. I don't know what their response is. Alls I know, everything I look at, I respond differently to, say, Van Gogh than I do to, Mucha, as an example. You can't always put your finger on what it is that you're feeling or be able to express what you're thinking or feeling, but you can recognize that you are responding to it differently. And that happens from style to style to style, from painter to artist to illustrator, whatever it is. You're having some sort of psychological interaction with it, subliminally, sometimes not subliminally. Sometimes you're like, oh, wow, I know why I'm experiencing what I'm experiencing. And so my time on Promethea, since we were exploring art, it really opened up the idea to me. I'm like, well, why are we having to adhere to one style? So when we started exploring the Kabbalah, and like one issue is devoted to impressionistic art, one's devoted to looking like woodblock printing, things like that, all the way to the end of the story when Alan decided to have all of his other America's Best Comics characters get involved in the Promethea storyline. And instead of me going, oh, I'm going to do my interpretation of that character, I'm like, no, can I make that character look the way he looks like coming out of his own book? Because the people are responding to that character, the readers are responding to that character in their own book in a very particular way. And in order for that character to feel like they're true to themselves, I need to see if I can maintain that for the integrity of it all. And then I just kept going with that, and I kept finding new ways to explore that same mode of thinking after Promethea, finding ways to get at that. And a good example is the Black Glove that I did with Grant Morrison for Batman, where you had all these characters, they all felt like they stepped out of their own type of comic book drawn by somebody else, because of that same mode of thinking.
As someone who can barely draw my own style, I kind of love you and hate you. So, so when you're saying it's kind of almost unconscious, like, are you planning each one of these things in a kind of each one of these styles to fit a different character for a kind of conscious intellectual reason, or are you just kind of going with a more emotional state? I mean, there's one thing you wrote on your blog, actually, I wanted to read, where you say, I think it was towards the end of the blog, so you're probably delirious with lack of sleep, but intentions behind the movement of every line and brush dab of black against the white surface of the board. Intentions to imbue the images with something intangible, attempting to capture unseen energies and emotional resonance, to evoke something, anything beyond the superficial, something that is alive inside the image itself, but can be transferred across invisible threads of connecting one idea to another, across vast distances to anyone who seriously looks, to anyone who sees through ink and paper to a morphic field. This is what I'm after, linking author-illustrator to the viewing audience, reaching somewhere within them in defiance of time and space.
I'm surprised I wrote that. Yeah. Because that's the other thing I want to say about exploring these different art styles. I think that's the other thing I learned early on in my career was, especially on a book like Promethea that talked about the history of creationism and not creationism, but creative arts in various ways. I quickly learned, like, okay, who am I to think I'm original? And that's, I think, the biggest challenge for any artist, I think, is to understand you can be yourself and still not be completely original, because everything we do is derivative of something that came before. This is 2018. There have been visual artists since the dawn of time. Nothing we think of is going to not have been thought of by somebody else. So how do you find ways to make those ideas be true to you? And that ultimately kind of led to a little bit of my thinking there, in the fact is just go for what you can try to evoke in somebody. Don't worry about, how can my drawing of Batman be the most unique drawing of Batman ever seen? You're not going to do it, Just try to put yourself into the drawing. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, thank you. Speaking from a purely geeky point of view, are you using different tools for these different styles? I mean,
yeah. A lot of this one is washes, Copic markers, traditional inks, stuff like that. Because I really wanted you to feel like, for this one brief moment in this one scene, Batwoman's world is colliding with this world of this doctor, this behind-the-scenes doctor who treats, people who are criminals, and that their two worlds are two different worlds, but they're intersecting for this one moment because Batwoman needs something from her. And I wanted to make you feel like when Batwoman is talking to her that you've stepped into this other person's reality, which is about how we all kind of are, right? We all experience the world in our own ways. We all live in our own little realities, but we all intersect with each other from time to time. And our perceptions are different. You could perceive a moment very differently than I could, even though we experience the same moment. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of a little bit speaks to that too, by creating these different looking stylistic characters.
So now that you're writing this at this point with Haden Blackman, so are you is this coming through in your scripting process as well? You're trying to write for those different points of view on reality and emotional resonance? Or?
Yeah, I try to. Sometimes I don't, but other times I'm conscious of it ahead of time. Sometimes whatever I put down on paper, I end up not following. I might do something completely different because even though that's the weird part about writing for myself is I have to think about stuff farther in advance than I'm used to when I work with another writer. Because usually I just sort of let it speak to me and it'll tell me what it's going to be at the time of drawing it. I don't like the whole style of her. I knew I wanted a different style, but I wasn't sure what I was going to do until at the moment, the day of starting to do it. I'm like, this is telling me this needs to be this,
All right, I had to use this because anybody who knows me at all knows that I'm kind of obsessed with Wonder Woman, just a wee bit. This is just a spectacular double-page spread. It's this beautiful illustration. So two questions about, what is, you've worked with a lot of kind of iconic characters who are owned by corporations, and so they have this kind of life that goes well beyond any given creator. So it gives them this kind of archetypal, persona within the culture. You don't have complete control over them, but at the same time, you're kind of collaborating with other people through time as well as in the moment, right? So is that exciting for you? Do you like that?
Yes and no. There's the geeky side of my personality is like, oh my God, I get to write Wonder Woman and draw Wonder Woman for this 5-issue run of the storyline where she's teaming up with Batwoman. That's super exciting. Haden and I both are geeking out over doing this. But at the same time, whenever you're dealing with characters that are not yours, they're owned by a corporation, and there's a whole team, slew of people who you probably have never met before that might have something to say about it. And that's a challenge, when you're a creative individual, because you just want to do your thing. But sometimes the thing that you want to do might not jibe with what editorial envisions. Which was interesting because like when we first started writing this arc called World's Finest, our goal was to have this team up between, two leading female superhero characters and find out what the differences are between them. And we really wanted to get into each of their head spaces, but particularly Wonder Woman, and get into her thinking, which at the time her regular book wasn't really doing. They had a different narrative style. And so when we first started presenting that, at first people were like, oh, well, this doesn't seem quite like it matches that, but it's cool. Do we let them keep doing that, And they let us kind of do our own thing because we didn't rely on Wonder Woman's continuity in terms of plot elements. And so it felt like, this could be autonomous enough that they trusted us to explore that type of storytelling with her inner monologue.
Yeah,
captions.
and I love that it's really beautiful, the writing here. Another thing, one of my absolute pet peeves with kind of certainly superhero comics and kind of action adventure comics is oftentimes a kind of depiction of the female form in action. And I mean, action is always stylized, and violence is certainly stylized throughout the genre. But the kind of weird contortions that female forms will often go through on the comic book page are really frustrating. And this is incredible. I mean, this looks like a woman's body going in like full-on action, right? So do you use models? How do you achieve that?
No, I don't use any models. I have a good mind for remembering what things can look like or what I remember them to look like. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty, anybody knowing anatomy really well could probably pick that apart and say, well, that's wrong and that's wrong and that's wrong. But the goal is for it to feel right. The reason I don't use models, even if I'm trying to be realistic with shadows and whatnot, is because I kind of feel like, for me personally, I have nothing against people using reference models or reference photography, but for me personally, I feel like the way my mind works, I would try to make it look too much like that, too much like the reference, rather letting the drawing be a drawing. And so that's the main reason why I, don't use reference materials. It can be a struggle though sometimes because I'm like, my brain at that time, it becomes a puzzle because I'm like, how does that work?
I did hear this story that, like on Desolation Jones, I think it was, where the main character has a very specific kind of car, and that you didn't use photo references for that car. No. That completely blows my mind.
It's a bit of a half-truth. I did use reference materials to look at the car and study the car for, a day or so, just kind of like, what's the car look like? And then I put it away. So if I ever need reference materials for a particular object, like a car or gun or anything, I look at what those things look like, but then I put them away and let my imagination imagine what it looks like from that point forward. And then, even then, I purposefully will not draw in any of the angles that the reference material was. So I use my imagination for it to become a drawing. It's a representation of that thing.
I love you and I hate you. So I mean, with Wonder Woman's outfit, though, you've got to get that right because otherwise, corporate's going to come down on you, right? So you've got to presumably, yeah. You just kind of studied her outfit and then just didn't.
Well, one of the things I purposefully left off, I don't know if they ended up changing it along the way in her own run at the time, but her trunks had stars on her ass, and no. I just left them off, and they never said anything to me about it. So we're like, whatever. Because I just felt like I tried to draw it that way, and I'm just like, it's not working for me, and so I just left them off. But without relying too much on reference material, you then end up going into a kind of a catch-up game where you're like, oh wait, did I remember? Was that in the right spot, or did I miss an object or a piece of? Like if someone has a particular necklace, this happened to me all the time on Promethea, where I would forget a part of her costume or what she was wearing, and I would catch it. And I'm like, oh my god, I gotta fix it. And sometimes I've had to fix that after it's already gone to the colorist. Most of the time, I'm pretty on point, but every once in a while, you just you get caught up in the other details and something slips by.
Talked about this. This is amazing. All right, so this is again from Promethea. It's from issue 10, I believe, right? Which I think you guys won an Eisner for. Yeah. All right. So, and this is the kind of infamous sex issue, So, also anyone who knows me is that I'm particularly fascinated by how comics language can handle themes of sexuality and desire, and the act of sex in particular ways. I mean, I make erotic comics myself, and I just find it fascinating how comics can kind of as a kind of a language can handle erotica. So do you think about that? Because certainly Alan Moore has worked with a couple of different really wonderful illustrators, Melinda Gebbie, and also I think of John Totalben and the Swamp Thing Rite of Spring issue to kind of depict sexuality and eroticism.
A lot, yeah.
So how were you thinking about how comics handle eroticism in general? And then were you also thinking about what Alan Moore has done before with that kind of material?
The only conversations I really had with Alan about sexuality in comics, and particularly that it came up heavily with this issue, of course, because the entire thing was focused on this sexual encounter between these two characters. But what was fascinating about it, it's sex, but the whole thing isn't about sex. None of it is about the sex. And when you read this issue, it's all about a magical, metaphysical experience, and which I found interesting. But when he was talking about sex in his work, and for me, when working with him, I felt like I was in a 6-year learning experience with him and just absorbing what I can. And a lot of his ideas end up just sort of melting into my own thinking. But what he was trying to show here, and it was funny because when he first turned the script, the editorial was like, "Oh, I don't
Here we
know,
go."
but if we can, and they were kind of pushing back on him a little bit, and he and I ended up talking about it. He's like, "Look, sex in most stories isn't about the sex. The sex itself is story, and even if it's a titillating experience or something when you read it that you are aroused by it for whatever, it's not about that goal. It's usually there's something else going on. It's some sort of interaction between the two characters that is telling you, the reader, something about them. This becomes story, and with this was very much an exploration of that.
I mean, that's kind of like what you're talking about before. We were talking about violence and the depiction of violence, and I think in a good story, violence or sex becomes also about the character interactions, become about the thematic developments and all this, right?
Yeah.
So in this page, I mean, obviously there's this huge, there's a snake eating itself, its own tail. There's these symbols at the top. I assume all this stuff was probably in your insane, single, the script with all caps and the single space script. But
yeah, the scripts were so intensive that my wife Wendy helped research most of that stuff. So she would read the scripts ahead of time before I would, and she would sort of highlight the key things so I could kind of absorb it more quickly and get to the act of drawing. So, but there were certain things like, with this, the symbols, I believe, have to do with different chakras. Mm-hmm. So Alan, he's not telling us, showing us these symbols. He's just mentioning them, and so, if there's a way to incorporate that. And then she was like, "Hey, this is kind of cool," and we would do the research, or she would find books on it, and we would use the symbols to talk about the things that he's trying to convey in the dialogue and things like that, because very much that's what's happening in their conversation.
One of the other things I was thinking about is that your collaboration with your letterer must be pretty intense. Yeah. I mean, this is Todd Klein, right?
Yep.
So, and he's a genius letterer. He's probably won more Eisners than anybody.
Yep.
But it's, I mean, oh my God, like he must have gone through so much dealing with the Promethea series.
Yep. So yeah, not only is he trying to make Alan happy, he's trying to make me happy too. Because,
and a lot of it, I imagine, he would have to determine get the reading order, reading flow going, right? I mean,
a little bit. Early on in my career, many of you that are wanting to be comics artists, this is something I highly recommend: is studying how lettering works with art. If you're going to draw comics, I really feel like for you to achieve the best result is understanding reading flow and taking an active participation in figuring that out. And that's one thing I learned very early on, because my early stuff, the lettering placements would be really funky sometimes, particularly if I was trying to do something different with the layout. The letterer would be like, I don't know what's happening here, I'm just going to do this, and they would fight the layout sometimes. So I got to a point where I'm like, I'm going to figure out how to do my own balloon placements as I go, which opened up the doors for me to be more design oriented. And then when I started working with Todd, he's such a smart letterer, but extremely gracious at the same time. He could see what I was doing, and so we worked very much in tandem. I would provide balloon placements, and then if he felt something wasn't working the way I thought it would work, or I didn't allot for the enough space, maybe we would discuss it, or he would offer alternate solutions. So it was very, very collaborative, and I highly recommend if you can create that kind of relationship with a letterer and stick with that letterer. That's the hard part too, because job to job to job, editors will hire people that you don't. We're like, well, that's not the person I worked with last time. And so it's like a learning curve over and over again.
It does. I mean, so a lot of the people that we certainly read in the program and kind of have appear on stage are oftentimes kind of auteurs that do everything themselves. And there's a lot, obviously like a Chris Ware, Alison Bechdel, whoever it is, like they kind of do the lettering, they do the penciling, the inking, the scripting. I don't think you've ever done that, right? So. Is that something you want to do, or is that you do, or is the collaborative process something that you really enjoy and get more power out of?
I like the collaborative process, and it's also a matter of time too. So, like working with Todd, I was really fortunate to work with him because he's such a master letterer, and there's a lot I could learn from him. But I think he also appreciated that I thought about it. I didn't just do whatever, Todd, and just slap down some artwork and expect him to figure out the puzzle by himself. But in terms of, I don't know if I could ever letter my own stuff. I just don't have an adept hand in that way. But I do enjoy putting in my own sound effects and my own title placements, because after a certain point when things started becoming more and more digital, I started looking at that stuff and it was like just... A lot of stuff started feeling like it was just slapped on over the top and not feeling like it was interactive with the art. And so on Promethea stuff, I started looking for ways like, how can we make this work? And I put the idea in there and let Todd make it pretty, He would make it like, this is going to look cool if we do this with it, Yeah,
cool. So by the way, this is the next double-page spread after the last one, and it's the orgasm. And that is the coolest orgasm ever. I really have any questions about it. I just think it's awesome. So, I will say that it was a very kind of tricky thing to do, and pretty potentially, I can imagine you come into fire for having the sex scene between this kind of magical goddess character who has a kind of a young woman's form and a weazened old man, basically.
Yeah, the funniest conversations was with editorial Scott Doombeer at Wildstorm at the time is about we need more stars here. we need to add stars here. That's
a lot of gratuitous stars going on.
Yeah, that sort of stuff was really funny. The weird thing about this one is Alan specifically asked for it to be based on Jimi Hendrix's
yes, the album cover,
right? What album is that? Art of Love or whatever it is?
Sorry, That's His Boldest Love. Thank you. Yeah, which is also based, I think, on the Bhagavad Gita idea of Krishna kind of saying to Arjuna, kind of talking about how he is a manifestation of all the divinities.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's why he asked for that very reason. I think because the symbols of that versus the symbols he was trying to say here about the act of creation, the act of love, and how that affects reality. Yeah.
All right, so this is a double-page spread from the Sandman Overture, which you did with Neil Gaiman. One thing I did also hear was that you tend to want to work from a full script of an issue, and that I don't know if Alan Morris, some of the other people you've worked with, kind of hand you a full script for an issue, but Neil doesn't do that. So you have to kind of wait for each page to come through, or
well. Yeah, that's what I'd heard about Neil too, and that's what he originally wanted to do, and I had to tell him no. which was it was a funny conversation. But when I explained it to him and Shelley Bond, who was the editor of the book, they understood what I was saying. And funny, what's weird is like my time at Promethea, Alan wrote it only page by page, and you would never know it because it's so incredibly orchestrated. At first I was getting full scripts on Promethea, but then it slowly, well not slowly, but rather quickly devolved into like, here's 2 pages, and I would call him like, I'm thinking about doing this sort of thing, but I want to make sure it works, but can you tell me what happens on the next page? And Alan would be like, I don't know, I haven't written it yet. And I'm like, okay, well, we'll figure it out, I guess. And it's amazing that it turned out as orchestrated and complex feeling as it did. But after that experience, I was like, no, I can't do that forever, especially when I got to a point where like, you know, Promethea was more about like, oh, how do I make this page feel like it interacts with the page before it, and then keep that momentum. But as I grew in my thinking, I started becoming more interested in, well, how does page 1 relate to the last page? What can I do to, even if it's not obvious, what can I do to make it feel like it's cohesive as a whole unit? Right. And that's why I started saying no, especially when I started writing for myself. It's like, no, I'm writing a whole script for myself. I'm not going to accept anything less than that. And when I explained more about what I was trying to do with Sandman Overture, Neil's like, okay, but then, you know, and I said, if that means I have to wait before I can draw the issue, then I have to wait to draw the issue. I'd rather do that and feel like that you have something that feels like it's all connective tissue from beginning to end, that you could maybe find something that relates to what you saw before.
Well, especially, I mean, you do a lot of visual motifs then that kind of emerge. I mean, one of the things we saw with the Batwoman, for example, I wanted to mention before, was that you create different kinds of panel borders for different characters sometimes. So the Batwoman character has a kind of zigzag kind of panel border to represent her costume, whereas her twin sister had a kind of baroque kind of flowery thing going. Mm-hmm. So I mean, if you want to decide on things like that, you have to see how they play out through the whole script.
Right, exactly. I feel like, I don't know, comics can do, that's why I think comics are so great, is because it goes beyond just what's happening in the panel. You know, I take into consideration what's happening on the page, what's happening in the scene, what's happening in the entire issue. I try to have that be present in my head on every page. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's not happening at all. Mm-hmm. What you see there might not connect, but the fact that I know it is, I feel, important. It can inform decisions, even, you know, some decisions that might be very superficial. Yeah. And that's what's so cool about comics as a narrative form, because you can do that with the story, you know? You can either find symbols to set on the side that comment on the story, or play an interactive role with the story, or just evoke an attitude for a scene, you know?
Actually, here's another double-page spread from Sandman Overture, and this actually has one of the things you were talking about, which was incorporating the chapter title, because you can see Chapter 4 written across the top here, and it's kind of built into the buildings. So it's kind of a Will Eisner thing going on.
Yeah, I just thought it'd be kind of fun. Like when we were first figuring out I got the scripts from him, and he sent them to me, like the first issue, he sent it to me, and there was no delineation for, you know, credit, you know, bit or title or anything like that. And I'm like, what should they? I'm like, I noticed that you don't have a title or anything. Or I said, I really like to see titles in comics. I feel like it's such an old school geeky kind of thing to see. And I said, but, you know, I want to do it in a way that feels like it's interactive. And I'm like, what do you want to call it? I'm like, and I just randomly said to him, you know, like, well, what if there is no titles, just Chapter 1. And he's like, let's do that, you know. And so I figured out ways to, like, well, how do I make that incorporated? And so when he wrote this scene about this glowing city in space that we're seeing, it's approaching the reader this way, but you're looking down on it, even though it's coming at you sideways. I'm like, oh, it'd be kind of cool if we could kind of work that into the shapes of some of the buildings, you know, that sort of stuff. It's just creatively fun.
And this is supposed to be a city for stars, right? So it's built out of light. Is that?
Yeah, that was really difficult. I don't know if it's very effective, but especially because he was saying multicolored light, so I sort of have a jewel-like quality, but still feel like it's glowing. And I'm like, I don't know how we're gonna do that. And so when I drew it, I just did it in nothing but washes and a little bit of pencil line. There's no ink, like straight up ink lines in it, and then we just.
Cam, can you flip to the next one? I think it's the. Yeah. So this is your inks.
Yeah. Yeah. So the trick for poor Dave Stewart had to figure out how to make that look like it was all glowing jewel tones, you know. He knocked it out of the park, of course,
well,
you know.
Yeah, he's Dave Stewart, but still, I mean, so you were building up these forms with wash.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah, because I felt that was the only way to capture the glowing edges of it, to where, you know, where the buildings are turning white in the black and white art, keeping the shadows near those areas like that's fading out gives it that glowy kind of feel. And I think when Dave colored it, when he first colored it, he actually had the colors more saturated, and it felt denser. And so we talked about. I'm like, well, Neil's saying it's colored lights. So what can we do? And he's like, and so he figured out a way to kind of make it even recess the values in some way to make it seem more light.
And it also really pops the bridge going into it, right?
Yeah.
Which is done, I'm assuming, in this kind of Jean Giraud, like kind of early Mobius, Lieutenant Blueberry, which you seem to really like that, because I see that you've referenced that before in like Seven Soldiers. And,
yeah.
That's
my favorite.
Yeah,
I did a little bit in Batwoman too.
Yeah.
He's one of my favorite. That came about like when before Neil wrote anything, we had conversations about the sort of comics he was wanting to be influenced by for the story, and then he wanted me. We both were jazzed about the same ideas. He's like Jim Starlin, Cosmic Comics, and all this stuff. I'm like, oh my God, that's gonna be amazing. And then he's like, give me a list of things you're interested in. You know, like, what do you want to draw? And I'm like, and it went, I don't know, 50 items I just put in there: insects, westerns, Mobius, all this kind of stuff. And he found ways
they're all there.
Right, he found ways in some way to get it in there, just to make me happy.
Because you have those insects there. There's a kind of Kirby-esque insect things.
Yeah.
That's amazing. All right. Let's go to the next one. All right, so here we are, kind of at the looking into the future. This is art from Echolands, which you're working on with Haden Blackman.
Yep.
And who's the colorist on this?
Dave Stewart.
Dave Stewart, of course.
I don't want to work with anyone else.
Fair enough. So we've just got a few of these different images, so we can kind of flip through them. You've sent the art, the finished art, maybe, and then you see this is the black and white art. God. Let's flip to the next one. This is, and flip one more. I think that's the black and white. Yeah. So this is San Francisco. Well, first of all, you've actually colored a couple of characters here. So tell us about that.
Well, this is. The setting for the first part of the story takes place in this really strange version of San Francisco. You won't know why it's
Girl, that's a Tuesday night in San Francisco. I don't know what you're talking about.
You won't know why it's so surreal for quite a while. But going back to the idea of different characters having their own stories and coming from their own worlds, this was trying to take it even further in a little bit. Like, you have the little cartoon guy over there. You have these black and white kind of monster, like a Frankenstein monster guy, and
there's Blueberry.
Blueberry, right. There's even the buildings. I tried to get different styles in the buildings. So I said, okay, well, if I'm going to do that, let's do a couple of them that are painted, like hand painted, not digitally painted, because no matter how, there's a lot of digital painting that can fool you, but in comics, it's harder to do, to fool you into thinking that it's real paint. So I'm like, let's make these two characters real paint, but in two different painted styles. And that's how that came about. So I just, instead of trying to do them on their separate boards, I just did them right there. and handed it to Dave to finish it off. And because I kind of I don't know, I kind of feel like even if you're doing a random character over here who's just standing on the side for one panel like this, maybe that guy has a whole life. He's a whole three-dimensional individual that you just don't know anything about. What can I do stylistically and artfully that can kind of make you feel like, yeah, he's got a story. I don't know if I want to know what it is. Maybe I do. I don't know. It depends on what you're attracted to.
But when you're doing each one of these different styles, you're also just picking up a different tool, right? I mean, you must be like a brush or a nib or
Yeah. Whatever it takes to get the effect that I want. Both of those they're both done in gouache, but just kind of applying the gouache paint differently to each one. But then the Frankenstein monster guy is done with just regular washes, a little bit of black color pencil,
so how
stuff like that.
How long does this take you?
Too long. What's challenging about this new project? It's not as heavy in terms of fanciful border design work, where the challenge is with the layouts is the format. This book is going to be landscaped. So this is a double page spread.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that is extra
I didn't realize
wide.
that.
And when I decided to do it, I just wanted to do it to see what that would feel like, especially because this is going to be a very epic type of story. And I'm like, well, maybe we can find ways to make that feel more epic. And I was like, oh, it's the same dimensions. It'll be a piece of cake. It's not any different. It's just you're turning it sideways. It's not any, right? No, it changes the whole way your brain works. I was shocked and quite challenged by how difficult it actually is. The result is, though, it does create a sense of epic movement and the sense of flow. Like when you get to, I feel more comfortable now that I'm on the third issue. There's just this real sense of just flow, flow, flow. Just one thing leads into the next, and that is pretty fascinating. But it also, with a scene like this, it feels mural-esque because it's wide, you could see along a wall,
Yeah. Murals, scrolls, anything that kind of goes horizontal.
And that kind of goes back to a little bit about the digital format thinking. My hopes are for people when the book comes out, and for digital readers, what we want to try to hopefully can get the word out and tell them, turn your device sideways, lock it, and just scroll. That you don't have to do all sorts of zoom in, zoom out. Just let it flow.
I think that's all right. So this is another final. The final, I think, image from the book. This dystopian Golden Gate Bridge, and I can't wait to read. I really want to read this. And then maybe one more, and it's the original art. Yeah, I mean, can you tell us anything about what it's about? You don't have to. I'm going to read it anyway. So.
Oh, I can't. I can tell you, it's an action adventure story. It's unlike anything I've done before. The type of story. It's a roller coaster ride sort of thing. And that's the other thing that's been interestingly challenging. When you read it, when you read just the text, it's like this. So I wanted to find ways to slow you down with the art and be immersive in that way because it's such a fast-moving clip of a story. And that's kind of challenging for me because I haven't really I've done adventurous stories, of course, but not anything that's what it is. And it's also kind of a love letter to weird adventure sci-fi comics from the 1970s. I mean, you're going to see elements in there of course they have a giant sea serpent. That sort of stuff, because I love those kind of weird old comics that would have random stuff like that come up. And then the other thing, it's all developed between Haden, Blackman, and myself on a character that I created as a kid. And we just found the right story to put her into and built this whole wild world around her. And everything being so strange, even though it's San Francisco, unlike what you've seen before, there's going to be reasons for it, and there's going to be a big reveal as the story goes along, in the third act. And when you get to that point, you're like, what well, wait, okay, I've not been reading what I thought I was reading, and then you can go back and you're going to see there's like tons of clues to reinforce
awesome.
it. So
All right, cool. All right, well, I definitely want to read it. Hurry up.
I'm on issue 3.
All right, so I think if we flip one more, I think we're, so let's bring Wendy up on stage. Wendy Wright Williams. All right. Yeah. All right. Here you go. Make sure that that's on. So you guys did this, compiled, and you worked with editor Will Dennis, I believe, right, on this.
Yes.
And tell us about how the project came about.
Well, we live in Vegas, and the October 1st shooting happened, and Vegas is a very connected community. Everyone knows someone who works on the Strip or works in the hospitals there, and so everybody's very connected. And so when this happened, it was like, it just reverberated through all of the people that we knew in our community. And the enormity of what happened, we knew immediately that there was going to be a huge need. Just the sheer amount of victims, that there was going to be such a huge financial need. And we knew that there would be like a GoFundMe, or there always is for these horrible things. But our industry is really great about stepping up when something happens. When the Pulse nightclub shooting happened, there was a book. 9/11, there was several books. And that's one thing I'm really proud of with our industry. And we were kind of waiting to hear about someone stepping up and doing it, and we hadn't heard anything. And Jim on Friday night, we're night people, so he was on Twitter at 2 in the morning or something. And
Friday after.
right, unbeknownst to me, said, I don't know how to put one of these books together, but if someone would help me.
I just went on a rant.
Yeah, you should.
I just went on a rant, and the next morning I had emails from people saying, I will help you do this, And then I ended up talking to her. I'm like, hey, guess what?
Guess what? Guess what we volunteered for?
Good morning. Right, exactly. Here we go.
And we talked about it, and she's like, yeah, we definitely should try to do this, because it not only raises money, it's like she was saying, it speaks about the community and tries to help people in multiple ways. So
right, we kind of decided within the first couple hours that kind of what the tone was going to be. And we wanted a book that wasn't reactionary, because it's a very, charged subject. And so we wanted to have a civil conversation, and we wanted to honor what these people had gone through, take it seriously, and not exploit them, and give our community a voice, because there's lots of ideas projected on some place like Vegas. That it's people don't even understand that there's stuff beyond the Strip, that they're like whole communities where all these families live, and it's actually, the whole area is 2 million people, and that the Strip is just our industry, like cars are to Detroit. And
So was that the origin of the title then? Was that?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
It's a really beautiful title. I mean, it's.
yeah, thank you.
she did that.
We kind of always try to work on multiple levels, try to hit you on multiple levels in what we do, and that's kind of part of the title. One of our closest friends was on lockdown that night. She works at a very high-end restaurant on the Strip, and we actually were here in California at the time, and literally minutes after the shooting started, we're trying to get on the phone with our friends because, like everybody, we knew many people that worked on the strip. And we managed to get a hold of our friend, and, she's terribly scared, terribly upset. And because the building is on lockdown, the information coming in, it's almost like bad gossip. So, you're trapped in this building, you can't leave, and, rumors reverberate up through the building, and panic ensues, and everybody gets super paranoid, and, so then, they're seeing things on the internet where, there's bomb threats, there's more than one shooter.
Well, they're
shooter
being
was
told that the shooter was in their building.
Shooter was in their building because all the SWAT had shown up and locked everything down. And so people thought the shooter was in the building. And so that's going, she's like on the top floors, and so, we were trying to be a lifeline on the outside. Like, this is confirmed. This is not confirmed.
One of the stories actually talks about that, like
Yeah.
how you couldn't get information in, and it was through the phones that people
Right.
were hearing things. I did want to, so in terms of compiling this and reaching out to creators, kind of figuring, you have a really nice range of, and being, I've been part of anthologies like this before as well, and it's a tricky thing to do because the subject matter is hard to write a story about. Like, how do you approach this in a way that is respectful, but not maudlin? I mean, all the, so what were you guys looking for, and how did you make that happen?
We ended up creating a mission statement.
Cameron, if you want to have
Okay. So we ended up creating a mission statement that we send out to the creators that we approached, and talking about the tone, and that we didn't want, again, anything reactionary. We wanted every response to be thoughtful, because this is such a painful thing that these people went through, and you cannot, they don't need to hear your rhetoric. So we kind of just established goals that we wanted to cover, talking about gun violence in its various forms, and just to start the conversation and to hopefully have a rational conversation, and that was something that I thought we could uniquely do, because comics kind of hits you in a different way, and that maybe we can get some ideas in there. And what ended up coming back was so great because everyone took it so personally, and so I feel like a lot of the work in it is so personal, and I think that really comes through, and so I think you receive that information differently.
This feels a very personal one to me, because this is Cameron Stewart, and there's a sense of, he's a comic book artist who's done a lot of superhero and other kind of action adventure stories, and this kind of sense of, are we complicit as artists who then create images of violence in some way? Which this kind of, it's wordless. It's wordless except for the bang bang, and it's.
Yeah, it kind of goes back a little bit to when we were talking about Desolation Jones. A lot of comics have the violent nature to some of the content, and when Cameron pitched that idea, he was like, this is what I want to say. Is this okay? Because I'm really thinking about it, and I'm like, no, it's good. Ask these questions through this type of story. It's important to think about.
You guys you ended the anthology with this piece by J.M. DeMatteis, and Mike Cavallaro was the artist. DeMatteis, I think, is one of the great writers in comics. I mean, yeah.
I would love to work with him.
Yeah. So tell me, why did you guys decide on ending the book with this story?
Well, we knew two different reasons. Aesthetically, we opened up with a story called Whoa, You're from Vegas, What's That Like? From his name is Warren Ellis. He does a lot of work for Oni Press, but he's a very good friend of ours. We've known him for a long time, and he used to live in Las Vegas. And his story had this interesting, unassuming feel to it because he's a very much a cartoonish style guy, but it ended up saying something very profound. So just on a superficial level, we knew, okay, well, if we're going to start there, we need something that visually can balance that out at the end, but still have a similar emotional quality. And when I first read this story, it brought me to tears. And every time I read it, it does. And the amount of information that he's able to get into these 8 pages is astonishing. But no matter what the book does, how it ebbs and flows in different directions, this story brings you right back home. And he kind of summarizes everything the book is talking about in these 8 pages about where we were when it was like for him growing up and how his life evolved and how these incidences and the viewpoints of violence, gun violence evolved and all this stuff. And he got all this stuff in there, but by the last page, he's like, don't forget about Las Vegas, you know? And it was just like, whoa, you know.
Drop the mic. I'm not gonna do that actually because these are inviolable.
It just felt like the definite. But when we book mapped it, we were trying to figure out the flow of it, and we both were like, yeah, that's got to be it, you know.
Well, I really want to thank you guys for making this book, and let's give it up for J.H. Williams III and Wendy Wright Williams. Thank you guys for everything.